strips tend to curve to the right, like candles blowing in the wind. What is it?
Okay, yeah, so the vertical axes are the zero locations, that would be zero velocity, and then the colors and the curves are just correlated to one another.
Okay.
Yeah. So one feature that you can pick out here is the Lee vortex. So I should mention that the profiles are plotted in time from right to left, so trading the migration of the dune for time, you can think of this as flow from left to right. So as the flow goes over the dune, it separates and creates this Lee vortex where we actually saw a reversal of flow close to the bed within about a 5 centimeter zone. If you then look forward, you can see where the flow reattaches to the dune just beyond its trough. And then beyond the reattachment point, you see the development of a new boundary layer where you have increasing amounts of shear in this very thin boundary layer moving on to the next dune crest. So next, this is the sort of a picture of how the turbulence goes in this type of flow. It's been documented before that most of the turbulence in flow over dunes occurs in this Lee vortex region. And really the turbulence over the Stoss face is fairly minimal except for some advection of eddies as they are advected through the Lee vortex. So this magnitude of turbulence in the Lee vortex region is going to come up a little bit later with the sediment transport measurements, so just bear that in mind. Moving on, this is the combination of the inversion of sediment concentration with the flow rate, so average sediment fluxes. Now these are really concentrated in a very thin layer near the bed. In some cases, we barely resolve the gradient of the sediment flux. So I've just joined these points with a black line just to let you know what's going on there. But you can still pick out some qualitative features. One feature is that with the recirculation and the back eddying on the Lee face, you get a convergence of sediment flux. So there's sediment converging on the dune crest. And there's also a downwards flux in that area. So that would mean that sediment is being deposited onto the bed. And then over in this reattachment area where the boundary layer is redeveloping, you can see there's an increasing amount of downward sediment flux with increasing amounts of shear in the boundary layer. So from this, you can sort of build an overall picture of how the suspended sediment transport is contributing to the dune migration, where we have this erosion over the Stoss faces and deposition and convergence on the Lee crest. So the dune migrates from left to right. Next, let's look at the boundary layer characteristics. So moving a little bit closer to the bed. And here I'm just going to focus on two representative profiles, one on the Lee and one on the Stoss face. These are plots of the inverted sediment concentration as a function of height above the bed. Here I've just chosen the bed level somewhat arbitrarily by a concentration threshold. So one thing about these measurements is we actually measure into the bed itself, and it's not clear where we should actually call where the bed is. That's how high resolution we're measuring. Also, there's a really strong gradient in the boundary layer, so really the suspended layer is only about 1 centimeter thick. And I've just fit these data points with exponential profiles to sort of draw that out. And the other point, of course, is that in the Lee region, where we had, remember, a lot more turbulence, the thickness of the suspended layer is about double what it is over the more concentrated Stoss face. So just to sort of summarize that last point, these are plots of the total vertically integrated suspended sediment load as a function of time. And on the bottom, this is the location of the bed, just to give you an idea of where it is with respect to the dune. And this plot is of the length scale from those exponential fits. So again, over the lee face of the dune, where all the turbulence is, you get about a doubling of the thickness of the suspended layer. So you can think of these exponential fits in terms of like a diffusion model, where you have a balance between the settling velocity of the sand and the turbulent eddies. Next, this is the inverted grain diameter as a function of height above the bed. So again, the blue line is the inversion in the over the Stoss face, and the black line is over the turbulent lee region. First of all, we do pick up vertical sorting within the suspended layer, which is really nice to see. So heavier particles are less likely to be suspended higher up. And the other sorting that we were able to pick out was the sorting between the lee and the Stoss. So we saw that qualitatively in the field, just looking through the sidewall of the flume. You tend to get a lot of coarse sediment over the lee face, and you can see the more uniform and finer sediment that's, in this case, not active. But that would be more representative of what we saw over the Stoss face. And then again, just to take sort of a summary perspective, this is a time series of the bed level grain diameter. So that would be these 2 points here as a function of position along the dune. So again, coarser sediments over the turbulent lee region in these two cases. About 20 microns diameter larger. And then here's so moving on to the velocity data. Here I'm focusing just on the Stoss face, where we had this nice logarithmic velocity profile. So I've fit the mean velocity data in the boundary layer to a log profile, and these are the fit parameters here, which is right in line with what you'd expect for this kind of flow over these 400 micron sand grains. But what's really interesting is the data that we get actually moving down towards the bed in this really highly concentrated region, and then even inside the bed, at least as what I've called the bed. So in this, what really is the bed load layer, we have a really high sediment concentration, and we still get velocities of about 5 centimeters per second. So there's some nuances as to how we actually interpret the acoustic data in this region, because we don't exactly know what kind of scattering we should expect from so much sediment. So we have a PhD student in our lab, Jenna Hare, who's going to be using this experimental data to try and suss that out. And she's also doing some lab experiments with more of a controlled setting to try and understand the acoustics of this bed load region. My interest in the bed load region is more of the fluid sediment interface, so just above the bed load layer. And one of the things I'd like to use this data for, so this is sort of moving into future work, is trying to parameterize the interaction or the pickup of sediment above the boundary layer and into the water column. So this is thinking about how we can use these small-scale measurements to help parameterize larger-scale models in order to give them sediment as a function of, say, shear stress. So to start to look at that, I've been looking at the erosive parts of the dune, the Stoss face, and trying to compare the different statistics that we can get from the MFDOC to the statistics of pickup of sand through the boundary layer. And a natural thing to do is to compare the vertical flux out of the bed to turbulent events that are impacting on the bed and picking up the sand. So this is a plot of the bed level TKE, so at the 0 coordinate, over 100 seconds over the Stoss face. And on the bottom is what I'm calling the pickup events, which is the vertical flux events at the top of the boundary layer, so sediment that's being picked up and entering into the water column. So the expectation would be with more TKE, we can expect more shear and sediment is going to be lifted up. And you can see that in a few cases that's really the case. So you see this nice correspondence between a TKE event that's reaching the bed and pickup of sand through the boundary layer, and some other events that I've highlighted here. But of course, it's not always the case. Sometimes we see big TKE bursts at the bed, but no sediment is being picked up. And other times you can see that there's a lot of sediment being picked up in this nice big plume, but there's no obvious TKE to associate to it. So as future work, I'm going to be looking more carefully at what other turbulence statistics can we look at like quadrant analysis, and also looking at maybe advection effects to try and understand how these two quantities could be related. Another way I've been looking at this data is in terms of log likelihood histograms. So if we just take this time series and plot it in terms of a histogram and looking at like how common are these large events, for example. So that's what these plots are showing. So each of these sort of triangles here is a histogram of pickup at the top of the boundary layer. And it's plotted on a log scale. So the fact that these are linear shaped means that we have sort of an exponential distribution of flux, vertical flux. And that's true for both the pickup and actually the deposition. So even in cases where we have more of a depositional environment on the lee face, you still see this nice exponential distribution of vertical flux. So really it's the momentum of the particles that's exponentially distributed. Maybe this can help to better represent the statistics of sediment pickup in larger scale models. So if we understand these very simple exponential statistics, maybe that can help us understand uncertainty on larger scales. And another interesting point to note is that there's people in the bed load transport community in unidirectional flow who have done experiments where they use video to look at individual sand particles. In this case, I think the sand was about 500 microns. And they also find exponential distributions, in this case of the downstream momentum of particles that are moving along the bed. So there's been some theories developed to try and explain this for bed load that I think could maybe be used sort of by analogy for the sediment pickup problem, which is a big problem for nearshore parameterization. So that sort of brings me to the end. That's all that last stuff is kind of future work and work that I'm doing right now, so I'd love to hear any thoughts that you guys have on it. In summary then, I think a nice thing about this experiment is that we were able to use the MF dot combined with some other instrumentation to look at all of the scales of sediment transport simultaneously. And I've only just started to look at how we can try and link those scales together with this data. So we saw everything from net sediment transport on the scales of kilograms per minute in the total bed load observations, going into the boundary layer and looking at the thickness of the suspended sediment over just a few centimeters, and then all the way down to the scale of the bed interface, which is really just a few centimeters squared measurement, and looking at milligrams per second type fluxes. And at the smallest scales, I'm interested in trying to use this MF dot data in this experiment and in future nearshore experiments to try and better parameterize what's going on down there. Thanks a lot.